Hello, hello. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Welcome all, and thank you for joining Women's Way for the Closing the Gender Wealth Gap Forum, Catalyzing Change in the Labor Movement. I just want to say that when we refer to women, we mean trans and cis women and femme-identified people, which includes anyone who is not a trans or cis woman, but who identifies as feminine, and also those who identify as gender expansive, non-binary, and or gender non-conforming. So hello again, I'm Diane Corman-Levy, the Chief Disruptor of Women's Way, and I'm delighted that you all decided to spend the next 90 minutes with us. While we wait for folks to sign on, I would appreciate you taking the poll, which will pop up. We want to know if this is your first time attending a Women's Way event. So if you could just take that poll, that would be great. So today's forum is part of a year-long series whose purpose is to educate different stakeholders about the drivers of the gender wealth gap and action steps each of us can take to help close the gender wealth gap. We launched this series in October 2020, and since then we have conducted 19 forums that have addressed different drivers of the gender wealth gap, such as strengthening the early childhood education sector, gender and racial disparities in healthcare, increasing access to affordable housing, promoting equity in grant making, and creating a more equitable tax code. Today's session focuses on how building worker power through organizing can improve wages, benefits, and overall stability for workers. You will hear from 4 amazing panelists who will address the issue from advocacy, organizer, and lived experience perspectives. You will also have opportunities to ask questions to the speakers via the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to address as many of your questions as possible. So please submit your questions throughout the session. Closed captioning is enabled. If you do not want to see closed captioning, you can click Hide CC at the bottom of your screen. The chat is also enabled, so please share your comments during the session. We'd love to see how people are responding, reacting to everything they're hearing. And to create a safer space for all of us to engage in honest and challenging discussions, we ask each of you to abide to the session norms listed in the chat box. Finally, we will record the session and make it available to you to view again, and for those who cannot attend today's session. After the session, we will also send you a list of resources related to today's topic and a survey to evaluate the session. And please complete the survey, because we do value your input and we use your input to continually refine and improve these educational forums. So before we introduce you to the panelists and moderator, I first want to give a special thanks to our session sponsor, Comcast Universal, for their generous support. And now for the next about 15 minutes, Kelley Sheard, the director of the Gender Wealth Institute, and I are going to spend again, about 15 minutes providing an overview of the economic state of women and why Women's Way is investing its resources and addressing the gender wealth gap, and how today's topic is related to the gender wealth gap, and really importantly, what we can do to help close it. So Women's Way was formed in the mid-1970s, and we hold a unique place in the nation's history as the first umbrella funding federation in the United States that was specifically dedicated to women's issues. So we've been around for a long time. And we are a for gender and racial justice organization whose mission is to achieve gender and racial equity by building collective power. This is why this session is so important to us, about building worker power, to disrupt systems of oppression and strengthen alternative models centered in love, liberation, and inclusion. So I want to briefly talk about the economic state of women, which has not been great for a long time and still not where we want to be. Many women are still surviving and not thriving in our region and our country. 80% of workers in the United States are still living paycheck to paycheck, and a majority are women. And 47% of Americans are not able to cover an unexpected $400 expense. Again, majority are women. We still have the highest poverty rate among the 10 largest cities in the country, and the region's largest demographic group living in poverty are women, ages 25 to 34. Now, the gender wealth gap, which we will be talking a little bit about today, is larger than the pay equity gap. And I think a lot of people know more about the pay equity gap than the wealth gap, but the gender wealth gap is more significant and is actually worsening. Related to the gender wealth gap is the retirement gap. 80% of women are likely to be living in poverty by age 65. And if these current trends continue across economic, health, political, education equality, the gender parity will not be achieved until 2133. And folks, that's way too long. So we need to do something and accelerate the process of closing the gender wealth gap. So what is the gender wealth gap? Well, single white women own about 56 cents to the dollar compared to white men. If you go down to Hispanic women, they only own 10 cents, and non-Hispanic Black women own 5 cents. And we'll talk more about, well, why. If you look at the U.S. economic pyramid, the top 1% of the country holds 47% of the nation's wealth. And these are predominantly white men. The bottom 80% of the population only holds 9% of the nation's wealth. You'll see who's included in that. And many of them are women and women of color. So I hope you find this disturbing that 80% of the population only holds 9% of the nation's wealth, by 1% holds 47%. I want to share some statistics, some data points, because I think we want to create a sense of urgency, because people don't act unless they feel there's a sense of urgency, and there is a sense of urgency in our country. So during the past 2 years, the wealth of the world's 10 richest men doubled, while the income of 99% of humanity fell. The wealthiest 10 people now own more than 40% of all humanity. 10. Elon Musk, in 1 year of COVID, gained $118 billion. In the same year, United Nations estimated that 150 million people fell into poverty. I just want you to sit with these data points. The 3 wealthiest men, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Warren Buffett, own more wealth than the bottom half of America combined, for a total of 160 million people. Since 2009, 95% of income gains in our country have gone to the top 1%. Meanwhile, which I said previously, 47% of Americans cannot put together $400 in the face of emergency. Again, I want you to sit with that and really focus on what you're feeling when you hear this data. So why do we have an economic system where 1% of the population holds 47% of the nation's wealth, and the majority are white Christian men, and the bottom 80% only hold 9%, many of whom are women of color? So how did we get here? Right? These are questions we need to answer. And how does our current economic system normalize and institutionalize greed? In order to answer these questions, we need to understand how wealth and power were built in America in the first place, and how they currently operate. And that we also need to understand, this is a very hard thing because we don't hear this, wealth comes from the extraction of others. So the expanding pools of great wealth are created by financial extraction. For example, a growing crisis of families trapped in predatory lending and unsustainable debt. That is a form of wealth extraction. The stifling of small and medium-sized businesses that create jobs. That's a form of financial extraction. And what we're really seeing is dark money's attack on democracy. So every asset held by one person is a claim against someone or something else. Debt is the claim on your income. A share of stock is a claim on a company's value, and boosting that value often means cutting workers' income to increase profits, which is a claim against workers. So the bias rules of capitalism. We need to understand how they drive today's gender and racial inequities. And capital bias is the bias towards the maximum increase of capital, the maximum benefit to wealth holders, that operates inside the processes and institutions through which capital deploys functional power. Right? Capital is money that must limitlessly grow, no matter what consequences, what impact it makes on other human beings and on our planet. And one of the greatest forms of financial extraction is anti-worker bias, where income to labor is literally being eliminated so as to increase income to capital. Capital is at war against workers, and unfortunately, it's winning that war. There was an article in 2017, this is 7 years ago, in the Wall Street Journal labeled "The End of Employees." Never before have American companies tried so hard to employ so few people. And we're seeing this in the form of gig work, temp workers, seasonal workers, subcontractors, automation, offshoring. Literally, CEOs and all the investors are saying, how do we get rid of employees, period. And that is one of the goals of corporations. And it's really being accelerated. So when you hear about massive layoffs, this is what's happening. So what do we do about building an inclusive and equitable economy? Well, we need to create a new normal. We need to have a bold vision, one that provides solutions to centuries of systemic exclusion, extraction, and exploitation that really undermines not just those who are being exploited, but it undermines the economic potential in our country. So at Women's Way, we started the Gender Wealth Institute in 2021 with a vision to close the gender wealth gap in the greater Philadelphia region by advancing research and practical solutions that build wealth for women who are economically insecure. And this was built on doing about 4 years of work prior to prior to launching the Gender Wealth Institute, where we worked with over 100 partners to really try to understand what are the drivers of the gender wealth gap and what are solutions that we should be investing in. So when we talk about wealth, capitalistic form of wealth is pretty much assets minus liabilities, right? Well, when we define wealth in our work, we use a definition pioneered by friends at the Maven Collaborative, which includes much more than just material wealth. It also includes the subjective well-being, like how people are experiencing wealth, which means, do they feel like they have dignity? Do they feel like they have peace of mind and freedom? We also understand that subjective well-being pertains not only to an individual, but also to community. You can't build individual wealth without looking at community wealth. So wealth is also our communities are prosperous, resilient, and vibrant. Also, we look at wealth as how is it impacting the next generation, and do they have the freedom to dream big and become all they can truly be? So we're really trying to socialize folks to broadening the definition of wealth beyond the more capitalistic form of material wealth, but to really how are people experiencing it personally within themselves, their families, and their communities. So now I'm going to pass this on to partner in crime, Kelley Sheard.
Thank you, Diane. All right, so I'm going to start off by stating our theoretical framework for how race and gender interplay in the expression of power, as well as how our current economic system functions. So you can consider these points sort of like our key concepts. Next slide. First, a brief primer on racialized capitalism. We understand capitalism to be the private ownership of property where one class of people control and profit from the labor of the subordinate class. The social structure of capitalism reflects a system of relationships of domination amongst categories of people. The subordinate class is necessarily racialized, and the dominant class is white. As it relates to capitalism, whiteness is institutional, collective, and cumulative, and has little to do with individual experiences. It's a structural advantage that confers dominance and causes racialized outsiders to compete to seek the rewards and privileges of whiteness. Next slide. Wealth supremacy helps us understand why we exist in an economic system that believes wealthy people matter more than others. This concept refers to cultural and political processes and attitudes by which the wealthy accumulate and maintain prestige, power, and privilege, as well as how wealth is protected and grown by the privileged class. It's about the myths of extraction and exploitation that drive hoarding, as well as the system design that reflects the valuation and protection of that extreme hoarding. Next slide. Finally, heteropatriarchy is a logic that justifies the subordination of all those who are not heterosexual cisgender men. The civilizing projects of a gender binary, along with the construction of heterosexuality as normative, serve the interest of the dominant. Anything outside of the constructed norm is seen as deviant and unworthy, and therefore oppression becomes justified. There's an ethos of meritocracy and a system designed to protect the interest of the dominant. Next slide. Those are just some brief primers on 3 concepts that we feel are important. It doesn't encompass every idea worth mentioning, but instead offers a framework to understand how we get to dangerous outcomes like the gender wealth gap. Turning our attention to today's topic, we offer that framework as we focus on the idea of building worker power. What is power, and why is power important as we work to build an economy that works for everyone? Consider the capitalist workplace as a system of management and control that determines who or what has value in the production processes. Knowing that the social structure of relationships in capitalism puts workers in a subordinate class, you can see how power can shape the experiences of workers. Consider some different expressions of power listed here. All of these expressions are relevant when we consider the experiences at the workplace. Next slide. Typically, when people think of worker power, they think of members of a union. This slide shows some demographics of workers who are union members. Think teachers, nurses, police officers, etc. However, this leaves out many workers in a variety of industries and leaves the discussion about worker power incomplete. For example, agriculture, domestic work, retail, and fast food are dominated by women and people of color, but the labor movement has no unions in these industries. Furthermore, Black, Latinx, women, and immigrants predominate sectors with fewest labor protections. Next slide. Worker power calls attention to policies and structures that exploit, extract, and exclude the subordinate class. In the workplace, access to power has been shaped by racial and gender discrimination since the very beginning. For example, the National Labor Relations Act of 1935 excluded domestic workers and agricultural workers where 90% of Black women worked. As a result of exclusions like this, workers are often unprotected and vulnerable to abuse. Building worker power is a fundamental redistribution effort from the hands of a few owners to the hands of the many who prop up the workplace. Workplaces are sites of disparate economic and political power, but building worker power transforms experiences at all levels, including the political system. Worker power gives voice in our democracy and ensures that political and economic interests are reflective of the majority. Worker power is a resistance strategy against the concentration of wealth. Next slide. Labor law is an important feature to the conversation about worker power, as labor law often determines the rules by which power is allocated in the labor market. Labor laws demonstrate how the collective determines whose work is considered worthy of rights, dignity, and protection. However, universal occupational exclusions have always jeopardized the protection of low-wage workers, who are often women and people of color. These exclusions enrich the wealthy as business models work to cut labor costs, evade social insurance systems, and shift risks onto workers. Listed are some labor laws that have had mixed success in protecting all workers from harm, abuse, and exploitation. The complexity of labor laws mean that some workers are covered in some industries in some circumstances. As it relates to the wealth gap, without a union or the protection of labor law, workers are more vulnerable to wage theft and low pay, and less likely to have access to wealth-building vehicles such as retirement plans. They're also less likely to have health insurance. Next slide. If building worker power is a strategy to ensure protection from abuse and exploitation, as well as a way to fight against the concentration of wealth into the hands of a few, then what stops momentum and engagement in this power-building strategy? For those who work in industries covered by unions, it can be difficult to join in organizing efforts for a variety of reasons. Structural barriers such as unpredictable scheduling, lack of affordable child and elder care, and lack of language access can make it hard to participate. We can also be subjected to retaliation measures by owners, such as getting written up, being reassigned, or increased surveillance. Even the way unions function can present a challenge to organizing. Most often in the US, labor agreements are negotiated between a union and a single company or organization, whereas sectoral bargaining involves negotiations that involve an entire industry. Economists have shown that sectoral bargaining is more effective at reducing income inequality and racial and gender pay gaps. It's also very useful for fissured workplaces, misclassified workers, and disaggregated industries like domestic work. Next slide. Ultimately, building worker power is a resistance strategy. It's about workers having the ability to self-determine, have autonomy, and meet their basic human needs. It's about the well-being and dignity of the worker as much as it is about the economic potential and stability of that worker. Within traditional structures such as unions, there are strategies to transform mechanisms of worker representation at all levels, expanding their ability to organize without interference from employers. However, building worker power is not confined to those spaces alone, as low-wage service workers are increasingly turning to organizing and legislation to drive change. We cannot rely on the state alone to fight income inequality and wealth gaps. If we can foster empowerment and solidarity amongst all workers, including undocumented workers, incarcerated workers, workers with disabilities, and others typically left out of federal protections, we can create an economy that distributes power, protection, and resources to all members of society. Next slide. As always, our purpose with the session is to uncover the plot, that is, the intentions, actions, and outcomes. Next slide. I am very happy to introduce our moderator, Michael Robinson. Michael Robinson is the director of the Community Hiring Initiative at Temple University. He's the producer of the largest citywide job fair in Philadelphia and co-producer of the largest annual law enforcement job fair on the East Coast. He manages the New Chances Now series that prepares career seekers for the world of work. In addition to his role at Temple, Mike is a senior pastor at Greater Enon Missionary Baptist Church in North Philadelphia. He has served as the chairperson of the District Attorney's Youth Aid Panel, a diversionary expungement program for first-time juvenile offenders. He is an award-winning clergy member, collegiate leader, community leader, and human resources industry leader. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you so much, Kelley and Diane. Thank you so much for the invitation to moderate tonight's panel. Each panelist today brings a very unique connection and perspective on the importance of labor organizing. And we're going to dive into that in a moment. Each panelist will provide a brief introduction about themselves, at least 2 to 2.5 minutes. And then they'll briefly explain their connection to labor organizing and why they chose to sit on today's panel. First off, we're going to have Brittany Alston, Executive Director of Philly Black Worker Project.
Thank you, Mike. Appreciate the opportunity to be on this panel today. My name is Brittany. I'm the Executive Director of the Philly Black Worker Project, as Mike just said. We are a worker justice organization and a worker center in the city of Philadelphia with a focus on supporting organizing for workers who are in the contingent workforce. We describe the contingent workforce as the temp industry, the gig industry. So thank you so much, Kelley, for sort of already walking through what a fissured economy and a fissured workplace looks like, because I think we are seeing the deep impacts of that fissured workplace in the lives of our members. When we've been in the streets, it's been really interesting to see the intense impact and isolation that the temp industry and the gig work or the gig economy has on Black workers in the city. Our primary focus is in the North Philadelphia and West Philadelphia areas of the city. And there have been times where we are canvassing and we see maybe 80 to 90% of the people we're meeting on the street who have worked in the temp industry at some time. And that's usually pretty directly correlated to their experience as justice impacted folks in the community too, meaning that they are formerly incarcerated and often have been pushed into temp work because they are unable to get steady work, high quality work after being incarcerated. And so we're really excited to be on this panel to explore more. I was excited to be on this panel because I think that a lot of times Black women who are formerly incarcerated are often very invisibilized when we have these conversations. So being able to make these connections is really important, and their voices matter, and their ability to organize will shift this economy into one that does work for all of us. So thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Brittany. Up next is Kelley Burnett, owner of K.I.D.S and a member of the CCPU.
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity for allowing me to be here today. As he just said, my name is Kelley Burnett. I am the owner of a child care facility. I've been the owner of a facility for about 15 years, but I've been a union member since I was 17 years of age. I started off working for Bell Atlantic at the age of 17. So I was a CWA member for about 22 years. And now I am currently a member and a leader of the Child Care Providers United Union. I am here today to bring attention to the struggle of the child care industry, the high cost of care for the families that Diane was mentioning. Most of those families are single women that are of color. The high cost of operating a child care facility. Philadelphia is the largest county in the state of Pennsylvania, and most of the child care owners are women of color. And we are struggling to provide quality care for those families. I appreciate being able to be a part of this panel because I believe that it is important to understand that we as women of color have been fighting for a long time for us to at least make what our counterparts make, which is still less than. So I appreciate having the opportunity to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kelley. Up next is Candace Chewning. She's Deputy Director of the Office of Worker Protections for the U.S. Department of Labor. Candace.
Thank you so much, Mike. Hello, everyone. I'm Candace Chewning. As Mike said, I'm the Deputy Director for the Philadelphia Department of Labor, and I'm Director of the Office of Worker Protections. The Office of Worker Protections enforces the city's labor laws. I come from about 15 years experience in labor, first organizing my own coworkers, and then to move on to another decade of union organizing, and also working as a staff representative and working on contract campaigns and contract enforcement. I find myself at the Office of Worker Protections because I worked with a lot of our union leaders on passing and going to City Hall during public hearings for the Fair Workweek law, which is the city's predictable scheduling law. And there was a lot of conversation around enforcement of that law. And so, I found myself here in the Office of Worker Protections as the work was very similar to contract enforcement work. And I'm excited to be a part of this conversation today. I come from I come from a family of farm workers, cash workers, and union members, but also specifically for the Office of Worker Protections, the people and families who experience the most violations of Philadelphia labor laws are women of color, people of color, folks from low-income communities across the city. And so, the laws that we enforce aim to move working standards and to raise working standards. And that is so very important because that's exactly what we're talking about here, which is the gender wealth gap and where labor laws fit, where organizing fits. And so I'm excited to be here, not only for the topic and the conversations, but to be alongside all of the panelists today. It's just a wonderful experience. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Candace. Up next, wrapping out our panel for tonight is Aurora Muñoz, Organizing Manager for the National Domestic Workers Alliance, the Pennsylvania chapter.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Mike. Hi, everyone. Yes, I'm Aurora Muñoz. I am Organizing Manager with the Pennsylvania chapter of the National Domestic Workers Alliance. The National Domestic Workers Alliance works to win respect and recognition and labor rights and protections for the nearly 2.5 million nannies, house cleaners, and home care workers who do the essential work of caring for our loved ones in our homes. And in Pennsylvania specifically, we represent the 16,000 domestic workers working in the city of Philadelphia. I'm very excited to be here today. I think that, it's great to talk about power back to the folks who are often marginalized, right, with having these discussions, and to talk about the long history of domestic workers, migrant women, women of color, low-wage workers fighting for more rights and protections. Similarly to Candace, I came through the labor movement by organizing my own workplace and finding a lot of strength and solidarity with my coworkers. And through that, I started to organize other workplaces in my spare time. And then finally came back to my roots as an immigrant. And my mother and grandmother are both domestic workers as well, doing house cleaning in Texas and California. And so knowing what the labor movement had done for me, I wanted to support other women in that fight. And so I've joined the Pennsylvania chapter, and I'm very excited to talk about here the power that domestic workers, nannies, house cleaners, and caregivers are growing in Philadelphia. Thank you.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you, Aurora. As you can see, ladies and gentlemen, we have a very distinguished panel. We're going to move into our question period now. And when we think about women and the labor movement, from women that worked in textile mills in Lowell, Massachusetts, that formed the Lowell Female Labor Reform Association in 1844, to the newly freed African-American women working as laundresses in Jackson, Mississippi, that formed a union in 1866, we see that women played a pivotal role in the labor movement. But I want to pose a question to the panel. Where do women and gender expansive folks today fit in the history of labor organizing, and speak to how you're working to strengthen workers' rights? And anyone can jump in on that one. Don't everybody speak at one time.
I'll hand it over to you, Britt. Well, I'm happy you recalled some of the washerwomen's history. That's definitely some of the history that domestic workers like to recall, and we're in that long legacy. We always call it standing on the shoulder of giants. In something that a big event in labor history that is often ignored is the washerwomen's strike of 1881. We talk about this a lot in Atlanta, Georgia, where folks previously incarcerated, majority women, organized a strike against, folks who previously were their enslavers. And it's remarkable history to know that in 1881 this is happening, and it gives women, it just tells you how that women and gender expansive folks have always known what's at stake, right? Have always just been in the center of that exploitation, and have had no other choice but to organize and to fight back. Since the beginning of this country and up until now, it's been some of the most radical organizing has been, some of those most innovative and creative organizing has been from women of color, immigrant folk, gender expansive folk. And now we're seeing it that as our economy, as our labor changes, that all of these changes are happening to these folks. So we've seen, experiments in labor done for domestic workers are now being applied to many more people in gig work. And again, at the forefront of that organizing against these changes, the negative impacts of these changes are women and gender expansive folks. And I'll pass it over to Britt.
Thanks, Aurora. I love the strike of 1881. I think it's a beautiful example of the power of Black women and their organizing. One of the quotes that I love is when the Chicago Police Department quoted Lucy Parsons as more dangerous than 1,000 rioters. And I think that is another example of Black women's radical history in the labor movement and their ability to get it done. After being called that, she helped to found the IWW, and so I think that we've always been at the center of the labor movement's fight, and there is no fight without Black women. I think the sleeping, the porters of the sleeping cars, I think is another example of where women played a great role, even if their labor in some ways was invisibilized in that fight. And I think what is most important there is that oftentimes, depending on where we're looking at history, Black folks, Black women were not allowed in labor unions. And so it wasn't that there was no exploitation happening, right? There was still a deep need for us to figure out how we protect ourselves against exploitative employers. Like Aurora said, that just required some more creativity. And so, Mike, to your question, I think that one of the largest lessons that we've learned from history and what places us now is our ability to think creatively when we know that policies and laws have intentionally carved us out of our ability to be protected, while also recognizing that there's a need there. And so I think domestic workers are a great example through their Domestic Worker Bill of Rights in the city. And the Black Worker Project is following in their footsteps and thinking about how to organize temp workers and gig workers to have their own Bill of Rights so that people have legislative protections in place when they do decide to use things like protected activity or more informal collective bargaining agreements that allow them to be protected on the workplace. I think all of that comes from us examining how Black folks and other workers of color have existed outside of traditional labor unions and still got their needs met through unionized forces, even if they weren't labor unions per se.
And I love your commentary about the inclusiveness of Black women throughout history being a pivotal part of the whole labor union movement. When we think of one of the most iconic figures in labor, in the labor movement as it relates to women is Rosie the Riveter. We remember that poster, it's very iconic. But a lot of people don't realize back in the 1940s that hundreds of thousands of Black women in the 1940s were in the factories working while men were at war in World War II, holding it down here in America. So that's a great piece of historic information that you bring up about women in labor as it relates to minority women. Any other panelists want to provide some amplification or additional feedback on the question, where do women and gender expansive folks fit into this historic labor organizing? And personally, how are you working to strengthen worker rights?
So I just wanted to add, as an educator, that educators the first statewide strike for an educator was in Florida in 1968. Educators are mainly women. And it seems to be, even now, there was a recent strike in the city of Philadelphia. So it just seems to be a systematic thing that women are striking everywhere, no matter their employment status, in regards to trying to get what they are deserved, what they are giving or providing to the community, what their actual employment or profession actually means to the rest of the working population. Because without some of these things, other people cannot go to work. Their profession doesn't exist if they don't have people caring for their children or have people that are educating their children. So it's been a long time coming. It's just, it's an ongoing thing. And the more powerful we get, like Aurora said, the more powerful we become. You can't not see us, we're everywhere.
Candace and Kelley, when you think about power in the workplace, what has been your experience with power in your particular work, and what strategies for building power are you currently using?
So I feel like people mistake my kindness for weakness. So I feel like I get in the room because I have a soft-spoken voice. I am quiet. I'm very respectful, and I'm very well educated. So I get in the room, but then once they let me in the room, they just don't understand the power that they let in, the wind that is coming in that door. Because I'm coming to make sure that I leave with something that I'm asking for. And I think that that is our power. It used to be thought that women were like barracudas, or, a powerful woman had to be mean and nasty. And that is actually not the case. We are becoming more powerful because more women are educating themselves. More women have master's degrees. More women are, trying to knock down those doors and proving to themselves that this is where I belong, not asking anymore.
All right, I love that. I'm gonna give you 2 snaps on that one. Candace, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you, Kelley. And also thanks for the question, Mike. So I thought that your definitions of power were really interesting. I often think about power as, being able to stop someone from doing something or make someone do something. And in labor organizing, that's really like the power of negotiating that contract, right? Stopping your employer from doing something or making your employer do something. And Kelley, like, I really like that, like, I feel like this is really connecting with what you're saying there too, as far as being in the room and leaving with something. And I think what's interesting with being on the workers' rights side of and being part of the city now is with unions growing so much and workers' rights growing so much for a time, there has been a lot of fighting back. As far you can see that with union density decreasing, right? And so very interestingly, now there's a lot of organizing around workers' rights legislation. Not that there hasn't been in the past as well, but looking at that and thinking about now there's like this organizing where workers are not just organizing between their employer, right? Like they're organizing with legislation in mind, which the legislation tells the employer to do something or not to do something. It's very different than the collective bargaining agreement in a way, right? Because that's direct. The collective bargaining agreement's very direct. And so I do think it's like another tool. And so it is something that we see. It is, you know, like most of the laws that were passed within the city were passed with a lot of organizing behind it. Um, outside of that, I think, you know, within the role of the office, we see, you know, when we're interacting with everyone involved, whether it be workers or employers, et cetera, you know, I think we can see a lot of power at play in that as well. And so, you know, this question about like how we're seeing power or where we're seeing power, we see it all the time. Certainly within the city. And, you know, what's been my experience with building power within my work is, you know, the office itself is, our mission is to advance and promote workers' rights, right? That's what we do. And so, like how we see that interplaying with like the ability to stop something or the ability to create something is, you know, where the work itself. So yeah.
Brittany and Aurora, when we think about labor organizing, we think unions, but there's so much more to it. There are more organizing that happens outside of the union institutions. And what does it look like and where? And also, how do these efforts interact with more traditional structures for worker protections?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question after Candace's no, because I think one of the tools that we see in our toolbox is being able to use government as a tool to hold employers accountable. And so I think the Office of Worker Protections has been really helpful for non-unionized workers in that way, whether it's making sure that people understand their rights through wage theft laws, whether it's, you know, the fair scheduling legislation. We actually see a lot. I mean, the nature of temp work is this very like last minute process of placing people where there's gaps. And so inherent in that is like no respect for people's schedule. And so there is, you know, an ability for us to like empower workers to know what rights they have. And, you know, with a specific focus on women, if we look at women who are also caretakers, if somebody is giving you 24-hour notice to show up for a job, what do you do with the person you're caretaking for, right? And so in the temp industry, oftentimes that might mean that you actually get blacklisted or you're not banned to go back to that temp agency, and they are in violation of a law. And so those are really useful tools for us. I think there's also room to think about, this is, I'm sure, very different Aurora with with domestic workers, but we do want to think about what collective bargaining looks like outside of maybe a traditional labor union structure, but when there's enough power, what bargaining with employers can look like. So I think there's some creative ways that we can think about holding employers accountable because we have power, but I think at its base, we are still in need of building power amongst a certain worker base, and that is not different between a formal or traditional union and a more alternative labor structure. It still requires a base of workers who feel empowered to take action against something that they want to change. And
Aurora, what say you? I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Brittany.
No, I was going to say, I think unions in the city have actually been really supportive of our efforts and see the value in making sure that the floor is raised so then their contracts can be even stronger. When the floor is at the, you know, below the floor, then you're fighting from far lower than you would if you had a higher standard to begin with.
Aurora, any thoughts you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, organizing domestic workers who are very isolated throughout the entire city, have one-to-one relationships with their employers, working in homes directly with their employers. It's difficult, right? The traditional labor organizing, you go to the shop and that's where you are having conversations with your coworkers. You are organizing committees there, and everyone has the same person to bargain against, right? It's one employer. And so where we do a lot of our organizing is where we can find domestic workers. It's at the parks, it's at churches, it's at community organizations, because there is no single place. So it is very difficult. It's through the phone. It's now through Zoom meetings. It's coffee chats that we can find in the middle of their busy work days. But a lot of what we're organizing for is also different. As Britt said, it's these legal protections. In May of 2020, domestic workers won the Philadelphia Domestic Worker Bill of Rights, which guarantees, which gives some protections that were never given before to domestic workers. We have the strongest law in the country now protecting domestic workers, including a written contract, including 2 weeks notice before termination, which really support workers in this kind of isolated work. What we use from traditional labor organizing is a lot of the tools, a lot like organizing committees. The conversations that we have to move people to action are very similar. And as Britt said, we have a lot of connections with unions currently, because a lot of that, the work to get people to move to action, is very similar across industries. Working through that fear, the fear of the employer that holds a lot of power in your life, and particularly for domestic workers, they hold a ton of power. You're in their home. It's one-to-one. Often with domestic workers, it's a chain. They're referred, for cleaners, people who have more than one employer. It's a chain. So if you ask for your rights in one place, or you are seen as being too disruptive, then that could affect the rest of your workload because of those recommendations and the nature of domestic work. So a lot of how we're building that power is the same as traditional unions, is the building of solidarity. And as Britt mentioned, it could be more complicated for domestic workers to bargain, as in one whole industry, with like as many employers as there are workers. But through solidarity and through shows of collective power, demonstrations of collective power, we can say domestic workers, we're not going to accept below minimum wage or below $10 an hour. If everyone and if all workers belonging to the Alliance can say that, we're not going to accept to work without a written contract. But this takes solidarity. It takes a lot of organizing. It takes a lot of deep, intimate conversations one-to-one with workers. And that's the work we're doing right now, to win better protections. And hopefully, we'll have saturation of a whole neighborhood, and we'll start experiments there of demanding from entire neighborhoods of employers. So that's the work we're doing now. It's all also, as we've mentioned, it's all experiments, really. We haven't won worker power fully yet. We've seen bits and spurts of things, and so we're trying different things. We're learning from traditional labor organizing. We're learning from community organizing and from many other experiments around the world. So
Awesome.
That's how we're doing it.
Awesome. Kelley, I want to bring you in on this. Kind of dovetail on what was just said. How easy or difficult has it been to organize with others in your field? And why do you think that is?
So it's been difficult to organize others within my field. And it's because different counties are, I guess, their perception of things are different based on where they live. And it's just in the state of Pennsylvania that we're talking about. But I'm originally from Allegheny County. Allegheny County struggles for
I used to live in Pittsburgh.
Oh yes, that's where I'm from. So Allegheny County struggles are different than Philadelphia struggles. Philadelphia educators are stronger. Philadelphia, if you used to live in Pittsburgh, if you think about Pittsburgh and how slow it is, and how not slow as far as cognitively slow, but it's just not a fast-paced life. And Philadelphia is different. It's a larger city. So people are more confident, and it plays out that way with educators in those counties as well. So all of the smaller counties, it's difficult because the women are fearful of losing their businesses. The women are fearful of being outed to the powers that be, like the Department of Human Services or things like that. Oftentimes in the city of Philadelphia, more of the providers are single. They own their businesses, but they are single women of color. In the
So
surrounding counties, I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, I was just going to ask Candace, to kind of, segue into something related. When we think about labor law determines the rules by which the power is allocated. And when we think about that, what has been your experience based on what Kelley has said and others? What has been your experience with labor law as it relates to organizing?
Sure. So, I think oftentimes labor laws can be used to organize, right? Like you're not following the law. This workplace is unsafe. Oftentimes those things are defined by labor laws, right? OSHA laws around safety. You're not paying me overtime, right? And organizing. Labor laws are also determined, like they determine what you can organize on or about or when you can organize, right? Like you can't strike in the middle of a contract, for example. So I think there are limits to labor laws, right? Where you're organizing and fighting for the rights of your membership and your coworkers. There may not be a labor law to lean on, in which case you just organize, right? You continue to organize. So I think there is the Office of Worker Protections in the city. Again, we enforce the city's labor laws. We where the labor laws may not cover issues with the partners that we work with the labor unions that we work with the workers' rights organizations that we work with. We work with those organizations to create programmings that might be able to. So just from an administrator perspective, we're an example of that would be with the National Domestic Workers Alliance and the COVID-19 Worker Relief Fund, where we worked with the National Domestic Workers Alliance and 13 other organizations across the city to distribute $2.2 million of relief to workers who did not receive relief from the federal government. So in that's where we sort of live on the administrative side of things.
Brittany, there's a term when we think about females in the labor movement. There's this term dignified workplace. How does a dignified workplace function, and what does it look like, and how does it feel, and how would we even know that even exists?
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful question. I think it allows us to have a vision about what we're looking toward, which I appreciate. I think we would know it exists because workers would tell us it existed. And I think that what it would look like, or maybe even feel like, is that, one, we are able to make decisions that are directly informed by the experiences of workers in that position or in that job. I think it would look like very clear mechanisms for collective bargaining so that the ability to advocate isn't just informal, but that there are structures that support people needing to change things in their workplace. I think people's needs are met. And so there should not be concerns about whether or not I need multiple jobs to feed my family, to pay my rent. And I mean, I think that we have a gender analysis in how we're talking about this work in this panel. And so I think that we wouldn't see disparities because of race, gender in the most expansive form, but that people are able to go to work and know that they will be treated equally no matter what and how they identify. I could probably just do a whole panel on other things that it would feel, but I would want to hear what other people think because I'm sure I'm leaving something out that would add to that feeling or ethos in the workplace.
Let me throw out a question for anyone on the panel to respond to. I want you guys to think about your labor movement hero and what leader or movement organization. For instance, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union is one of the largest unions that have a vast majority of women. But what leader in labor or what movement organization inspire you these days? Who's your hero, and what labor movement organization inspires you the most? Don't everybody speak up at once.
Um, I do know who my historical person is, and it's Ella Baker, because I think that she did a phenomenal job of centering the political education of Black folks in the movement. And I think that's something that we all need to be dedicated to in building leadership ladders that allow for folks to come up. And I would say that one of the people who's inspired me in our labor movement locally is Nicole Hunt. She's the president of Local 634, was the noontime aids and climate staff for the school district of Philadelphia. I think that she has like a very radical candor in how she relates to her membership. And I also think that she knows, because she's a rank and file member and now president, what membership needs and how to recognize when membership needs to be pushed beyond where maybe they are comfortable, while also respecting what people want in her membership. So that is the person that I would lift up.
Awesome. Any other panelists would like to take a crack at that? Who's your labor movement hero, or maybe give us a commentary on what leader or movement organization inspire you these days? Candace?
I can jump in. I thought Aurora was about to hit the unmute as well. So I paused a little bit. So I think in history, throughout history, I'd say Larry Itliong, who was a Filipino farm worker who stood with Cesar Chavez during the grape workers strike, and also Suko Lee, who led the dollar store strikes in, I think it was maybe the early 1940s. But I'm going to be honest, Mike, you kind of threw me on the the more modern question, like who is it recently? And I would have to say, and also agree, I come out of Unite Here as well. I agree. I think Unite Here is doing great work, not only in the city of Philadelphia, but nationally, as far as working with other organizations like the Restaurant Opportunity Center, but also working towards immigrant and gender justice nationally, and supporting policies, federal policies, and pushing for federal policies that do that. And I'd have to give a shout out to my old lead organizer from Unite Here, Lisa James Taylor, who's no longer with us. I like her leadership throughout the years, continue to inspire me today. And I think it's because her leadership comes from the fact that she was a woman and a Black woman, and I'm sorry, Kelley, you kind of spoke to this as far as being soft spoken. I think sometimes these things that that are a part of us when people think of leadership styles, I think often people think of men. But again, I think Lisa led with her heart, and that will always inspire me.
Okay, as we kind of wrap up, I want to have some commentary on this question, and I would love to get all of your feedback on this. Based on those who are attending this webinar today, there's this clarion call, right, for us to impart great information to them on how they can go from this meeting, be empowered, be better advocates, be better agents of change. What is something everyone on this webinar that they can do now to support your organizing efforts or organizing efforts in general? What advice would you give them?
I would say organizing advice in general, if you are employed, organize your workplace, right? So always start where you are. But I think for the Philly Black Worker Project, if you are interested in following along with the work that we're doing, we try to keep everything on our social media so that you can follow along. There's a budget season happening right now, and we want to make sure that folks are fighting for a people's budget that does have a really expansive department budget for, well, Candace is on the call, but for the Office of Worker Protections, so that we can make sure that there are enough investigators to support the work that we're doing and also outreach efforts. So I think being able to plug into a people's budget action or call to action would be something that you can definitely follow along on our website and our Instagram. It's Philly Black Workers, literally spelled just like that. Yeah.
Awesome, awesome. The question is, what is something everyone on this webinar can do right now to support organizing efforts? Let's hear from the rest of the panel.
I think something, well, as Britt said, organize your workplace. If it's not organized, or get more involved in your union if you are, fortunate enough to have one. For domestic workers, if you are an employer of domestic worker, a lot of folks don't think that their employers recognize that and know that you have responsibilities. The Domestic Worker Bill of Rights is online in the city's website. You can, if you don't have a contract with a worker, you could start those negotiations. If you are a domestic worker, join the Alliance. We are, yes, our power only grows with more folks. People power is central. And as Britt said, we're also supporting a people's budget. Currently, this is this is how we're engaging with City Council to having an expanded budget for the Office of Worker Protection. And I would say that, and following Britt on Instagram also supports, because we're doing much of the same work. And I would say immediately now, I think that everyone could think of work differently. And often we think of many other issues, social issues that are happening, but really labor is so central to wealth and to the well-being of all folks. And so I think really having that connection, and as we've said, the labor movement, unionizing has, those efforts have decreased over time. And I hope that there's a big change, and there has been in our communities. And yeah, just think about work, think about yourself as workers and where we fit in within that power structure.
Kelley, Candace, thoughts?
So I want to start from a social emotional perspective for those women that are afraid. Take a step back. Think about how frustrated you are, how sad you may be or angry that you may be about what's going on, and take a step forward and organize for change.
Let's open up for some Q&A from the audience. We have 37 folks logged on. We had upwards of, I think, 42 people at one point in the discussion tonight. But let's open up for a Q&A for those that are with us. So for all of the participants that are logged on, feel free to put your question in the Q&A, and we'll have a crack at it in terms of the panel responding. So the floor is yours. Those that are logged on as participants, this is your opportunity to bounce your question or concern off of this elite panel. You could put your question in the Q&A section of the Zoom, and we'll take it from there. And I just want to personally thank this panel. You women are amazing. All of you are my sheroes.
Oh, go ahead, Kelley.
Might be of the same mind. While folks are putting questions in the chat, I just wanted to ask the panelists, if you are new to this topic of worker power, right, and you're thinking, oh, I never really thought much about this, or maybe I work in a profession where I'm not covered by a union, but I wonder how this applies to me, or how I can learn more. Is there something you would recommend that we either watch or read or engage with that would help to deepen our understanding for this topic, particularly if you are a member of, if you work in some organization where there's not a union present, and so this is all new to you? What should we do? Any podcasts we should listen to? Any documentaries? Any books we should read? Where should we start?
I just want to say this. I was a Women's Way Changing the Narrative Fellow. And I just want to say, find an organization like Women's Way, especially if you're not sure of things. They have so many different initiatives going on for women that empower women. And so find an organization such as Women's Way.
There's a question in the Q&A, and this is from Miss Cheyenne Sadowski. As someone who works in a daycare center, how do I begin to organize a union? Or if it needs a union, I always think about it, but it feels so normal for there not to be a union. And how does someone change that?
So I guess that would be me.
Okay.
I would suggest you get in touch with the Child Care Providers United Union, and they can tell you if there is an organization process going on for your particular facility. If your facility is a chain, like a large facility that is in multiple locations throughout the US or throughout the state of Pennsylvania, there probably is an initiative going on, and they'll be actually able to connect you to other educators that you can speak to and see if you have a common ground.
Cecilia Thompson has a two-part question for the panel. One, how do you organize without fear of losing your current job? And then part two, how do you convince others they should be unionized, again, without them fearing loss of employment?
I will say, and then Candace, feel free to hop in. The reality of organizing is that, you know, you will always be in a position where your job may be on the line, right? So we do not, I see everybody's shaking their heads. If somebody tells you it's not, they are lying to you, right? That is not a real thing. But what is real is the power of like solidarity with your coworkers. And so I highly suggest people forming committees, talking to organizers who may be able to support in your organizing so that you are not putting yourself on the line without any cover. And I think to the second part of, which means that your coworkers will also be scared that they're going to lose your job, right? And some of the beauty and solidarity is that you all are protecting each other from the employer. And I think that, there are really cool methods, I would say, as far as resources, maybe a book like, what is it? The Successful Organizer, the Jane McClevey book. Somebody can put it in the chat. I know somebody knows it. But they have they have clear steps, right, around how you move people from fear into action. A lot of that is intense relationship building, but there also are some like really clear tools that I think you can use as a workplace organizer to help move your coworkers from a place of fear, agitate them, and move them to a place where they want to take action because they recognize that something has to change.
From Misha Rodriguez, has there been a push to advocate for trans, non-binary, and femme-identifying individuals in the workplace, where how you dressed is policed?
So there are a lot of folks organizing around femme, trans, gender non-conforming, non-binary workplace rights, and I think that it's the same answer that you're going to hear from a lot of folks on this call, which is like talk with your coworkers. I think one thing that I think is very, very important as a worker, as who has organized with my coworkers, is the value of a really good organizer. And when I say that, that could be your coworker, right? Somebody who's done it before. But if you don't know anyone who has done it before, there are lots of people who have done it before. So I do suggest like reaching out, like doing a few searches. I don't know any labor union that wouldn't respond to an email about a workplace that wants to organize. I don't think anyone on this call would not respond to an email about organizing. So I just suggest that you just reach out and talk to a human. I think that's like really the best thing that you can do, and not to be afraid, because there are people with a whole lot less who do it over and over and over again, and they need you to do it too. So I think that I would just really encourage that.
Thank you. These have been great questions. If there's some other questions from the audience, feel free to pose your question in the Q&A. Sorry about that, Diane.
It's okay. I just want to say something about organizing. It takes resources, and it takes time. And I'm going to shout out to the philanthropic world, those who are funding things. We need to drive more money into organizing, and because people need those resources. So we do grant making, and I'm talking to other people who do grants. I'm asking if anyone's in the audience who's a funder, and you want to see real change, put money into these groups that are organizing, to really create systemic level change. So that's my call out, my request, my hope.
Awesome. To the panel, based on questions that were asked of the audience and questions that I posed, is there anything that you feel you need to share in terms of some comments that can amplify an earlier point that was made, or address a particular question that was made earlier that you didn't get a chance to respond to? Any thoughts from the panel?
I just wanted to touch on the question about being fearful of losing your job. When you're sick and tired of being sick and tired, sometimes that's the step that you may have to take. But you'll have that camaraderie. You'll have that ability to rely on possibly the other people that stood with you that don't have their job right now. It's a process, because when you go through the process, you may get something back tenfold, but it's just a process, and you have to think about it as a process.
Athira Shanat shares that, are there any efforts to create more anti-retaliation legislation? And how well is the Workers' Bill of Rights being enforced currently?
Thanks, Adria. Yeah, so since winning the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights, as I said, in 2020, the domestic workers in our alliance, as well as elsewhere, have been attempting to enforce it. Enforcement, as our friends at the Department of Labor and the Office of Worker Protection, is tough, right? You know, winning new laws is difficult, and then enforcement is even harder, because people don't know about that they have new laws. So this is work that both the government as well as community organizations like ours is doing to support that education and outreach. And enforcing this is difficult because of what we're saying, right? The fear is still there for many people. And although retaliation is illegal by law, it's definitely illegal in many ways. We've seen, you know, people trying to unionize and they still get fired. We've seen it all over in different kinds, you know, in Starbucks organizing, we saw that. In you know, people being intimidated, that's all illegal. And so what we're currently working for is to create bigger mechanisms against retaliation, to give the Office of Worker Protection sharper tools to really go against that, so that folks can really demand their rights, the rights that they worked so hard for in their workplaces. And, you know, we've had definitely some successes with people going to employers and saying, I have this right under the law, and the employer listening and the employer doing that contract. And we've definitely seen people have a backlash against that. And we want to make it so that folks feel more supported when they are being so brave to demand their rights in a one-to-one relationship with an employer. We want to have more support for them, and we also want to have higher consequences for poor behavior by employers. And that's our current campaign that we hope to introduce very soon through legislation. Thank you for that question.
Awesome. Evan Cantillo says, how would you ask corporate philanthropy to show up in this space, in this whole conversation?
I mean, I think Diane already made a really clear call. I think that, you know, there's a real need for our funders and for the funding environment to see this as an opportunity to redistribute power, and power in the form of funding. This work is not easy, nor is it free. And so there is a need for people to resource it, not with some sort of immediate return in mind, but recognizing the work of building power is a long-term financial commitment that requires a long-term commitment to these organizations and to our leadership. And so I think that the call was clear that organizations like ours, you know, Domestic Workers, Philly Black Worker Project, other organizing bodies in the city, they need to be resourced, and they need to be resourced with like long-term change in mind.
Yeah.
Cecilia Thompson says, any tips on an organizer losing their job? What advice can you give them?
I mean, I could just say, you can file a complaint. You can file a complaint with a government agency. You know, I think it depends on what you're losing your job for and what the right is that you're organizing around. But if it's simply because of organizing, you can file a complaint with the National Labor Relations Board. And I can drop that in the chat.
Awesome.
Mike, I just want to say that there are foundations that are starting to move towards funding movement building. So one is the Samuel Fells Fund. They're coming out in April with a whole new funding strategy, and that's their priority. And so we'll put together a list of resources of funders that are really moving towards funding movement building and coalition building. So we'll definitely share that information with everyone.
I did want to add one more thing that I think would be helpful for funders, which is connecting us to other organizing efforts. Sometimes
Yes.
you all actually have a better purview of what's happening on the organizing landscape than we do because we're so in it and tunnel focused. And so I think another clear ask is to support us with connecting us to other organizing bodies that could be allies or partners in the work and movement building that we're doing.
Love
Great
that.
point.
Love it.
Great point. See, that's why
I'm
you guys are being paid the big bucks for those great types of answers.
I also had a last spot, a last little ping, because it's come up so much here. I think that interacting with your rights, for the employer should be typical and expected, right? They should expect you to interact with your rights. And however, right, a lot of these laws are created and are written in such a way because employers also provide input into those laws. This is a little touch on some of the limits to labor laws. But I would say that employers, or when you're working, like employers reacting to your organizing should also be typical and expected. And I think that the fear of retaliation is very real and very true. But I think that it's also typical and expected of employers, right? That's why there are retaliation protections and laws. And so if you're organizing, I think having a retaliation plan is going to be really smart on, like, here's what we should do. What is the employer going to say? How do we think that they're going to act? And I think, like, having that plan, not just between you and like a group of leaders, but everybody being on the same page, like, hey, when they do this, all 50 of us are going to do this together, right? Because when they do that to you, then they're doing it to me. That kind of workplace solidarity is going to be really, really important, and honestly going to be much stronger than filing a complaint, and much more direct and much more fast. You're gonna back them off, and just being really smart with that, and like being ready is your best bet. But I will drop the complaint form in the chat as well.
There's an organization called the National Labor Relations Board, and for the most part, you have, and correct me if I'm wrong, Candace, or any other panel member, I believe it's a 6 months window that you have from the time of the incident to file a complaint with the National Labor Relations Board. So if you have been fired as a result of trying to unionize, that's one major organization that you can approach to provide some muscle behind investigating your dismissal. Well, this has been a great conversation. I want to give our panel a standing ovation. You all were great. Thank you, Candace. Thank you, Brittany. Thank you, Kelley. Thank you, Aurora, for your feedback and contributions to tonight's discussion. I'll now turn it over to Kelley and Diane.
Great, thank you. As Diane is pulling up the last slide, I want to thank you, Mike, for your facilitation and your support of the conversation. And again, also thank the panelists for your wisdom and experience and engagement with the topic. And thank you in the audience. We thank you for your attendance and participation in the conversation. A reminder that the series is ongoing, so we'll continue to explore how to close the gender wealth gap with dates and topics listed here. We want to continue the conversation and engage more with you, our partners and community. A reminder to please take the survey and let us know what you thought about this event this evening, and also a reminder that we will send out a resource list. So the links and the organizations and the resources that were mentioned here and more that we didn't cover, that will come in the resource list that you will get after the event. So, and then the final reminder is just to check out our social media and our website for announcements and to follow us for more info and invitations to join us in the fight. So thank you all again. We appreciate you and have a great evening.
Thank you all. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.